So, today we are going to be talking about a couple things. Part three of our little building a Gatsby site series. We're going to be talking about a couple things. Kind of where we left off last week. We had done some stuff with our Gatsby config to handle some site metadata stuff, add some header management through the use of our head component using React Helmet, and all of that. Left us in a pretty good spot to kind of start customizing things a little bit more. Kind of where we left off, we wanted to start figuring out how to, like properly change site title and stuff as you move on from page to page, which led us down the road of needing to have a navigation, have a way to get to those different pages. And that leads itself to us talking about routing with Gatsby. Gatsby has some built-in routing stuff that we're going to go over today that makes it super easy to kind of navigate around your Gatsby site, nice and simple. So we'll go over a little bit of that. And then additionally, we're going to go over page templates, which are also a pretty straightforward, easy to use thing, thanks to Gatsby. So yeah, I guess let's just kind of dive into it. So like I said, we kind of left off with our document header management, the site metadata in the Gatsby config, and we're going to work in here a little bit. But the first thing that we're going to want to do is create a navigation component. We need to be able to move around to the different pages on the site. So let's just go ahead and get that handled right now. Now there's a couple ways that we could do this, and let me pull up a link here. Gatsby has a couple different ways of handling site navigation. In their documentation, one of the ways that you can do that is through it, just like a normal static navigation, right? Static meaning you essentially create a navigation component, you manually add the links to the pages that you're going to be creating, you manually output the various like ULs, LIs, the links to the individual pages, and all of that type of stuff. Kind of more of a hard-coded approach. And a secondary way, in the way that Gatsby recommends to handle navigation, is more of a dynamic navigation, and this is where our Gatsby config is going to come into play. This is where the site metadata that we started building out is also going to come into play a little bit more as well. So we're going to leverage this data here to essentially tell our navigation, like, hey, here's the pages, here's the name of the page, here's the slug for that page. Essentially, like, grab all of these site links and output them in the navigation and just go from there. And that's kind of what we are going to be doing today. So with that said, the first thing that we want to do is create a new folder here called components. And let's just start adding a navigation component. Yeah, super basic navigation.js setup here. We're going to want to import React from React, like we do with every single component. I'm just going to make this an implicitly returned component here. I'm not going to do anything super special or crazy with it quite yet. It's const navigation equals an implicitly returned. Oh boy. We'll just do h1 navigation. And then we're going to export default navigation from here. So this just gets us a very basic navigation component that we can then go into our layout and add. My thought process here is we're going to want to add this to the layout. This layout component is essentially like a globalized, template that we want each of our pages to follow. Global components like header, footer, if your site has a sidebar that's global throughout the entire site, this is where those things would go. At least this is where they're going to go for now for us. So we'll just kind of keep going with that methodology here. So navigation, and I'll let VS Code help me and auto import that. So we've got that. Let me reorganize some of this here too. So we've got, I usually like to have like my CSS stuff, my styles, import last. I like to separate these things between like global, like package-based things, and then components from other parts of your site here, and then CSS stuff. So just clean that up a little bit. We've added the navigation component to our global layout component. I'll save that, and you can see we have our navigation being output there. Cool. So that just gets us a navigation component that we can leverage here. So now kind of moving forward with the dynamic navigation approach. Like I said, we're going to be working in this Gatsby config, adding to the site metadata here. So like we were talking about last week, we do have the ability to pretty much add any amount of data that we want to this that's going to be leveraged throughout the site. The method that the docs kind of recommend here is adding your menu links, like I was talking about, with a name, the slug for that navigation item, and then kind of going through there and leveraging a static query like we did last week to get this information, to get this data using GraphQL, and output these menu links on the page. So that's exactly what we're going to do. I'm going to name this something different other than menu links because that's a lot to type. So we're just going to call this nav. Make it nice and short. So this nav is going to be an array of objects, and these objects are going to contain a name for the page that we're talking about. So we'll use pretty much the same markup that they've got going on here. And then link. We could even call this, if we wanted to, I mean, we could call this slug if we wanted to. That makes sense to me in my brain. So that's what I'm going to do. So we'll have name and slug, and then we'll do another one for just like an about us page, right? So we'll do name about us and have the slug be slash about dash us. Just to add a couple little objects here, nothing crazy. One of the things that I was thinking about over the last week was like how kind of annoying it is to like drill down into the site meta. Like if we look at our head, this string of data that like eventually leads us to the title is kind of annoying, and I'm wondering if there's a good way to like destructure this a little bit better, but I haven't come up with anything yet, so we're just going to live with the drilling down here for a minute. Okay, cool. So we've got the data for our nav. I always get hung up on this. Is nav the right name for this? I don't know. I guess it's fine for now. If I want to change it later, I will. It's not a big deal. Okay, cool. So we've got just a couple links in the Gatsby config. One of the things too, like we can, I'll reiterate this, I guess, but we can structure this this nav bit however we want, right? Like their documentation calls this menu links. We could add additional information if we wanted to have some sort of like SEO title for an individual page or some sort of data specific to that page that we wanted to pass down through GraphQL. We could do that as well. It's pretty cool the amount of like flexibility and customization that you can leverage through just this. So yeah, that's something to think about as we continue down the line here. So the next step here is going to be to utilize a static query to actually get at this information. So let's do something. So the strategy for like leveraging one of these static queries is through the use of like this just unnamed default export that passes down props to the static query and then allows you to pretty much just render out the component that you're trying to render with the static query. So we're going to leverage this same methodology here. Give me just one sec. There we go. Great. Cool. So yeah, we're gonna leverage the same methodology for our navigation. So instead of exporting a default navigation, what I'm gonna do is add an export default. Export default props, and then it just returns the static query component. Export default props, render out static query, which we will need to import from Gatsby. VS Code is very helpful, thank you. Import static query from Gatsby. We will also need to import the GraphQL tool as well. So we've got static query here. We are going to need to actually query something in here, and we'll just keep that there for now, and then render something out of here. Let's make sure that's the right markup. Render, query, awesome. I'm gonna close the Gatsby config for now. In the head, or no, I was using head. Let's go back to that. Cool. This way I can just easily switch between these two. For default props. Okay, cool. So within the query, we're going to just write a basic GraphQL query, just like we did in our head component. Within here, we're going to just write our own named query, which is going to be, we'll do a query that is called Nav Items query. Something arbitrary, that's fine. And then from there, we will drill down in exactly the same way as we did here. We will need to grab the site data. Within the site data, we need the site metadata. Within the site metadata, this is the thing that is just annoying to me. But within the site metadata, we'll need to grab the nav. And then for each nav item that we get, the only two things that we want returned are the name and the slug. And that should match up with what we have here. And once we run this query, it should give us back an object of navigation items that returns the name and the slug. We can test that out if we want. Let me do an inspect here, put that down there, and blow up the text so that everyone can see. Let's clear everything out in the console. So when we render this, instead of actually returning a component, do I have that markup correct? Just double check. Right. So in the render method, we actually need to pass the data down to the component or whatever it is that we are rendering. We'll just call this data to make it easy. And then within here, I can just real quick console.log data and see what we get. And naturally, I break it. Let's see, unknown field site. That's because I don't know how to spell. siteMetadata. Still an error. Unknown field nav on site metadata. Title organization, nav, got commas there. Cannot query field nav on type site metadata. Okay. Query site metadata nav. Interesting. Let's rerun the development server. Maybe it's just not aware of the array that we added here. Okay, good. We compiled just with a warning for the console, which is fine. I'll refresh this. Awesome. Terrific, great. So if we scroll through the console here, we'll see our site object that is just the data that we pass down to the render prop on the static query. And then you can see we can drill down site metadata, nav, and then here's the name and slug of the 2 nav items that we added to the Gatsby config. Cool, super straightforward. This is something that is pretty ingrained in how you work with Gatsby. So anytime you need to grab data from an API or just this internal stuff that we're doing with the Gatsby config, leveraging GraphQL is a good thing to practice where you can, and having this navigation be dynamic is just a good other way for us to practice that. Cool. So we've got that returning properly, so that's great. So we can, instead of console logging this out, we can leverage our navigation JSX that we have above there, output navigation, and then pass it some data. So instead of passing it this whole massive string, this is one way that we can shorten the drilling down into this object here. We can just pass the navigation, we'll call them nav items. And this object is going to be data.siteMetadata.nav. And that's it. That's all we need to send down to there. And much like we did in the head, we will also just spread our props into this just in case our navigation component ever needs additional props. We want to make sure that those are retained. So when I save this, the H1 with navigation should show back up. Of course not. Why would it work on the first time, right? Cannot read property nav of undefined. Const navigation. Nav items. Do we need to, I know that we need to pass nav items down to this as props, but it should still be rendering the components properly. Let's make sure I'm not forgetting anything here. We have the data being passed down here. We have it being closed. We're spreading the props. Exporting the props here. Oh, did I miss? No, this is just an implicit return. The 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Interesting. Navigation, nav items. What is the error that you're actually giving me here? Cannot read property nav of undefined. Nav items data. I think it's data.site metadata. There we go. I was just missing one of those things that we needed to drill down into. Cool. So data.site.siteMetadata.nav is passed down to our navigation through the Nav Items prop, which we have here. And then from here in this navigation now, we can just essentially start writing normal navigation markup, right? We can treat this like we would any other component. So for a navigation, we want a nav element. Within that nav element, we want a UL. And eventually what we're going to do, well, actually, we'll just do it right now, is we will take these nav items. Since it's an array of objects, we can map over those objects and output them as LIs. So let's go ahead and do that now. So within curly braces, that gets us into JavaScript, where we can start doing stuff with nav items. So we'll take those nav items, map over them. We'll map them as nav item, singular. So for each nav item, we want to render some stuff. And what we want to render is an LI that has a key, because anytime you map over multiple items, you need to make sure there's a unique key to separate these things out and avoid conflicts and stuff like that. Best practice is to generally not use just like an iterator, right? Like like I++ or using a number or something like that. So what we can use here, presumably as a unique identifier for the key, is the nav item dot name. You're probably not going to have multiple pages on your site with the same name. So it's probably safe for us to assume that the nav item name is going to be a unique key that we can leverage there. So we've got that. Let's just output the nav item name within the LI and see how we're doing. Man, every save, I break something. I don't understand. That's because I left the H1 in there. It's always something silly. Sweet. So that's nice and relatively simple. We have our pages being output from our Gatsby config in the data there. We're using GraphQL to grab those things. This is all essentially just reiterating some of the stuff that we did last week. So again, good practice here. The part that we step into now is the actual rendering through Gatsby. And I read up on like how Gatsby, the specific package is called Gatsby Link. Their routing is like super sophisticated and does a lot of really cool stuff just kind of baked into it. So instead of kind of like my next thought process when I was kind of going over this off stream was like, okay, cool. So now I have this mapping over all these nav items. Let me just go ahead and output an A with an href of whatever, and I'll leverage the slug there to output the actual href for this anchor tag. But what Gatsby-Link, the package, actually provides you is an element that we can import from Gatsby called link. And this component does a lot of really cool stuff. So I was reading up about it a little bit, and this Gatsby Link uses like an intersection observer. It uses the intersection observer API to essentially detect when this component is within the viewport. If it's within the viewport, it does like a low priority like prefetch to whatever the URL for that link is. So if it's an internal link to another page on your site, it starts to download some of the assets when it can for that page, just like the most critical of assets, so that it's not loading too much too soon. It doesn't want to assume that you're going to click on that link just yet. So it uses the intersection observer API to do that. But then it goes another step further, and it detects when you hover over a link. So when you hover over this component, it then makes another prefetch request to start downloading everything from that URL. to essentially anticipate you navigating to it. And once you do finally click on it, the transition between pages is almost instantaneous, because in the background it's been doing a whole bunch of stuff to kind of like get ready for you to go to that page. By the time you click on it, it's instantaneous, and all the assets are downloaded for it, and you're just on that page without even realizing it. So this little tiny component that we get access to does a whole bunch, and Gatsby did a good job using some interesting technology and like thought process for this component itself. So I was researching that, and I thought that was super interesting, so I figured I'd share it with you all there too. It's nice to understand like what things are doing in the background, rather than just kind of like, cool, I have this link and it's doing a whole bunch of magic, and not really understanding the actual like inner workings and stuff of the component itself. So pretty cool. But that's what we're going to leverage. So this gets into the actual true routing bit of Gatsby. We will leverage this link to direct the user to a specific URL when they click it, rather than just a normal anchor tag. And instead of href, this link component accepts an attribute called to, which is where you're telling the link where this link links to. And we will just use the data that we've received, so nav item.slug. And then within here, it acts as a higher order component, so you can just start putting markup within the link component. We'll just do what we were doing before and output the nav item.name and save that. So now we've got a couple of links. If we hover over it, it's really small down there, but you can see the URL matches the slug that we output, localhost 8000/about-us. If we click on it, it's going to 404 because we don't have we don't have a page associated with this. It should 404, but it shouldn't. It should 404, but not like error out like that. Cannot read property page of undefined. Interesting. Because this hello world starter that we started out from has like logic in it that should be handling if someone goes to a page that doesn't exist. It should output like a super basic 404. But it does not appear to be doing that. Let me look at my notes here just to make sure I didn't miss anything. Navigation, nope. Interesting. Well, we can keep moving on, and hopefully that won't come back to bite us later. Yeah, in any case, let me clean this up just a little bit. Make it a little bit more visually appealing. Cool. So we've got all of that handled. So that is really the basics of routing with Gatsby. So now anytime that we have a link on our page that goes to another internal page, whether it's a call to action or something that just links to another page, we'll want to leverage this link component so that the transition between those pages is instantaneous. You get access to all the fancy stuff that Gatsby did with the intersection observer API and all of that by using link here. So that is something that we will store in our brains for later as we continue down the path here. So the next thing that this kind of drives us into is page templates. So because we are linking to a new URL, we need to make Gatsby aware of the page that we have directed it to. Gatsby makes this like dead simple to do. If you've been following along since the first video, you'll know that we've worked in the index file a little bit here. If you've ever built a static site by yourself, you'll know that index.html is the first spot that your request goes to when it's displaying your website. This is no different. This index page acts as the home page. That's where we have the House of Giants text with the styled heading and all of that. With Gatsby, all you need to do to create a new page to make Gatsby aware of it is create a new file and name it the same thing as the slug of the page that you're trying to create. So because we named our URL, our slug about-us, the page in this folder needs to match that structure so that Gatsby is aware of it. While I was messing around with this, I did realize that you have to restart the development server when you create a page like this so that the watch function is aware of this file. So I'll just do that real quick. And while we're doing that, I'm going to keep this super simple for now, and essentially just copy and paste the whole thing, the entire index file, into this about us file, and just change the heading to about us to make it super obvious that we are on a different page. So we do that there, save that, and presumably when I click, do a hard refresh on the browser as well. You'll see that we're on the About Us page. We have the About Us text, and we can seamlessly like transition between these two pages without anything flashing, loading, doing anything crazy. If we look at the DOM, you can see that like the only thing that actually changes is this layout div. So like the rest of the site, the header, the metadata, the title, and everything that we have set up, it's not refreshing the page. It's just essentially like hot swapping the components that are that exist within the layout component that we've built. So it's just swapping those things in and out, making the navigation really, really smooth. So yeah, that's just a super basic way to handle page templates. You get all of the same stuff. You can start building the most complicated page React component system that you need to for your About Us page. But just for practice's sake, we can do another one. Let's create a file called work, assuming that we want to like showcase a bunch of work. This will be something that we work on down the line. So we might as well just add it here so that we have it. And I'll do exactly the same thing, just copy and paste the code from the index, change the heading to work, save that, and then anytime we add a new page, we need to make sure that we add it to our navigation, and in order to add it to our navigation, we need to add it to the Gatsby config data object that we've created here. We'll name this work. Have the slug just be work. Keep it nice and simple. Save that, and the Gatsby config just automatically refreshed. I'm going to do a hard refresh on the site just to make sure. Then when we go to work, you've got work right there. The developer experience for Gatsby is like super nice. Like it's really, once you kind of understand what it is that you're trying to do, it's really straightforward and just like nice to use. So even though we've only been doing this for like, I guess technically 4 weeks, but really 3 separate streams, it's been super fun to like dive into all this and figure out how Gatsby works and all of that type of stuff. So yeah, this has been super nice. So yeah, sorry, that was a bit of a tangent, but there we go. So this honestly, this covers pretty much most of the topics in the title for this video. But this has only been like 25 minutes. So a couple smaller like housekeeping things that I want to address in our code base while we're here. The first thing is understanding when it's kind of time to like refactor out a component into its own standalone thing, right? So because we have this styled heading being used in 3 separate places, I definitely don't want this code to be generated through styled components 3 separate times. We're leveraging the same styles for each one of the components. The only thing that's changing is the content within it. So as soon as you start to see a spot in your application, your website, whatever, where you are using the same component in just like slightly tweaked ways, that's generally a good sign for you to like stop, take a step back, and refactor the code so that you're, you know, essentially drying everything out. You're not repeating yourself. You don't have the exact same markup 3 different times, right? So that's something that I want to take care of right now. So let's go ahead and do that. The way that I want to approach this, I get like super granular with how I organize like my folder structure and everything. So within components, I'm going to create a typography folder for specific components for typography, whether that is like a page heading or a styled heading like this. This styled heading in particular is supposed to be it's supposed to be something that generally is actually probably only used on the home page, but I don't know that for sure yet. So we'll just kind of keep moving forward with how I was intending to do this anyway. So I'll create this typography folder. Within this typography folder, I will create a header heading component. And within this heading component, we are going to do this whole thing where we import React from React, import styled from styled components, and then I will create a implicitly returned function that is const heading equals arrow function that returns. It's just going to return the styled component and then the text within it. So before we go too far with that, let us go ahead and from the index take out all of this and move it to our heading component. So we're going to import styled, like I mentioned. We're going to import specifically that rich black text color from our variables, and we don't need to import layout from layout. That should stay in index. So that takes care of that. And the way that we want to leverage this heading component is exactly the same as how we were doing it as a styled heading. We're just going to call it heading. I want VS Code to just import this for me, please. Heading. I'm not properly exporting anything here yet. We export default heading. We want the styled heading to be leveraged here, and then we're essentially going to treat this heading component as a higher order component, so meaning that we can dump markup within this styled heading and have it still output, and that's simply done by adding children. We did this in our layout piece as well. This layout component is a higher order component that takes in these render props, the children, and then outputs whatever it is that you put within this component. Right there for you. So we'll do the same thing in our heading. We've leveraged styled components to create a const that is the styled heading. This just houses the color, the font size, whatever else we inevitably end up dropping into this component. Whatever styles we end up dropping into this component will live here. And that is about all that we need. I think we want to make sure that we are passing the children down as render props here. And I think that should be about all we need right now for this component. So let me go ahead and save that. In index now, I should be able to have header, heading. Heading is then automatically imported from components typography heading. And I will add House of Giants to the index, which is the page that we're on right there. If I save that, I should break it because that is generally what happens to me when I do things. The problem is that I did not import the rich black variable since we added a folder to the components. The path for the variables was broken. But once I save that, it looks like we're back in business. We can check that for sure by using, where are my React? This is so large that I can't really tell where my React dev tools are. Hello? Oh, they may not be in here. That's okay. I guess we can test this by just being like house of hello, and that should change. So yeah, we're leveraging the proper heading component that then leverages the styled heading, applies the styles to the H1, and then outputs the children, whatever that ends up being. And in this case, it just ends up being plain text. So that's a good example of like when to refactor something. So now our index file is like real clean. There's not a whole bunch of imports. There's not a, styled component that we're adding to the head here that's getting compiled 3 different times on these different pages. It's just leveraging the styles from this one styled component that we broke out here. So we can do the same thing for all of the other pages, which I will just copy and paste in here. Make it nice and easy. Let me change this back to House of Giants. We'll squish that back down. House of Giants. This is just going to be work. And the about us is just going to be about us. Save all that. As we navigate around, everything should be exactly the same. You can see as we navigate through here, this gross little class name that's output here, DuxTVQ, should be the same on every single page. DuxTVQ. This helps to reduce the amount of markup that's like thrown into the head here from styled components. When we had each one of these styled components defined in the individual page JavaScript here, it was outputting a different hashed class name for every one of these components. Because you're redefining a styled component, it takes that and creates a new hashed class name, applies the exact same styles to that different class name, and then applies that class name to your element. So what we're doing here is actually like cleaning up a lot of the markup and helping to keep things as reusable as possible. So all 3 of these pages are almost identical. They just have a little bit of different content, which is fine. As you navigate around, everything is ultra fast when you're kind of clicking around, which is great. And we have a nice clean layout here. What I like about being so componentized in all of this stuff is it provides you an opportunity to think about how you want your components to be used by other developers on your project, right? So like if I'm sitting here thinking about how other developers are going to use this heading component, right? I want to kind of sit and think like, okay, cool. So this is just a normal like styled H1 that has some specific styles to it because it is supposed to be like you know, super display oriented, like really obvious on the page. Like the design direction of this particular component is one where I want it to be incredibly large and in your face. But if we were to generalize this component a little bit more, like we now can consider, okay, do we want a developer to be able to use this component but pass a different level of heading into it? So instead of forcing them into using this styled H1, is there a situation where we want a developer to say, hey, I want this to be an H4? And for this particular component, I think the answer is no. We want this component to be very specifically styled to be this like crazy large display text. For right now, what may end up happening, and because I super generically named this heading, I'll probably need to rename this actually. Yeah, let's do that so as to not confuse myself later. We'll call this like display heading. And naturally that's going to break everything. So give me 1 second. There, and there. We just want display heading. On the index, we want the same thing, display heading, and the about us. Display heading. We want to export default display heading and have this const be display heading. There we go. All these pages still work. So yeah, the ability for us to really like drill down into the smallest version of these components is something that's like, it's been beneficial for me, especially if you work with other developers and stuff, or you're like collaborating with someone on a project. Drilling this stuff down into its like simplest form. Like if you're a fan of the like atomic design principles, or Brad Frost's atomic like development, like the folder structure and stuff like that. We're looking at the smallest version of a component right here, an atom, and we're considering whether or not we want this atom to have different toggles for it that developers can lean on to customize this component in particular. It's a good practice to do because it really gets you thinking about this type of stuff, and like your future self will definitely thank you for thinking about these things now in this very refined small context, rather than down the line when you have 60 different heading components that are all styled exactly the same that are outputting just a ton of CSS on the page and slowing things down. That's definitely something that you want to keep in mind. So doing things this way is helpful for me. I'm curious if anyone else out there has a different view on that. Everyone works differently, for sure. This is just something that has worked well for me, and definitely curious to see what other folks think. But in any case, I think that's a decent place for us to. Well, actually, no. We didn't get to the thing that we were trying to get to, and this is something that I was researching a little bit off stream too. Was like, now we have these pages. How do we get our head component to actually like understand what page it's on and then output, home, about us, work or whatever in the actual title? I don't have any notes on it because I didn't figure it out quite yet, but we can, it's only been 45 minutes, so we can kind of start trying to figure that out together and stumble our way through it and see where we get. So one of the things that I was looking at was Gatsby, I think actually the rendering sidebar data. We want to find an example of how other people are leveraging this head component, or like an SEO component. Let's just search Gatsby SEO component. Because we have all of this, and maybe this is where we end up needing to refactor how we are leveraging this head component, and maybe we change it to be called SEO. But I don't necessarily like that name for this in particular, because we're doing things that are not SEO based. Like, we're adding some Google font stuff. We're managing the head. The naming of it doesn't matter a whole heck of a lot. Kind of moving down here. This is just defining the SEO component, adding some default props and that type of thing. It's going through the static query to actually query this stuff out. Oh, I kind of do like how they split out the query into its own const and then added it to the static query later. I'm going to do that because this, I like to split things out as much as I can wherever I can, so I'm going to just do that anyway. Const query equals, oops, I will close that, equals that, and then I'll leverage query there. Make sure that doesn't break anything. The head's still the same. The fonts are still there. Even if I refresh, everything's looking good. Okay, cool. I do like that. So I'm going to do that on the navigation page as well, or navigation component as well, just to keep things nice and consistent. Const query equals GraphQL, and then we just add that to the query argument. Navigation still output, it still works, looking good. Awesome. That's nice. We got something out of that right away, so that's good. So then our head component is, adding the site metadata. That has, like, on the Gatsby example, they have like default titles, the title template, the SEO description, the site URL, all of that type of stuff. But what I want is to get the current page, essentially, and output the name of that page. Like, I don't know if we need to compare. Yeah, we'll keep reading and kind of see. So if we scroll down, does helmet have an attribute called title? And title template, what is title template? Where in the heck is title template? That's coming down from this site metadata. Oh, did they just interesting. So this %s, this string identifier here, is obviously getting replaced by the title, I would assume. And then when they add this SEO component to the page, I wonder if they pass a different title down to it. Okay, let's try that. So let's kind of reconfigure how we're doing our site meta data here. We can keep the title. This will just be like our default homepage title. And then we can leverage the title template just like they did and do exactly the same thing. That is, I just wanted to check to see if this is in backtext. It's not. I think we did this because this is just what the documentation did, but this is just a string, so it doesn't need to be in a template literal. It doesn't matter, I don't think, but in any case. So instead of in our head outputting the title like this, we're going to remove that whole thing, save that. This House of Giants will go away when I refresh. Instead of leveraging into here, we can leverage it within the helmet component itself and have it be title equals the, I'm going to copy that giant long string because I'm not going to remember it off the top of my head. So title is going to be data.site.siteMetadata.title. If I save that right now, it should come back. House of Giants is there, so that's good. And then in the Gatsby config, title template, we're going to do the same thing where it's %s. I missed the %s, and then I will use a just pipe to separate the two things. That's the title, and then we can have like a normal House of Giants, it doesn't matter, home. That's the title template, and then we need to add that to the helmet component. So title template equals data all of that. Did they have it shorter in the tutorial somehow? Oh, they just destructured it. Right? Is this where they're destructuring it? No, okay, so yeah, they're passing it through the render. Oh my god, this is hard to look at when it's this small. Let me blow up the text for you folks there too. Okay, so when they render on the query, yeah, they're essentially just destructuring this within the render method, which I guess that we could do. That just gives me a headache, though, looking at. So when we render within parentheses, and then within curly braces, then we have site metadata, and we've got title and title template, and then that gets passed down to, oh man, this just feels so dirty. Because then they assign it to a const called SEO, and then they conditionally output the title or the default title, the description, or the default description. I guess we'll just see this through and then see how gross I feel afterwards. Do that. Return the head within the JavaScript portion of it. Const meta, since I'm trying to not be specific with SEO. Title equals title. We can just do title, and they don't pass this into. Oh, I see. Okay. So we actually, the only reason that they're doing this is to conditionally output the title or the default title. I'm not going to worry about that right now, so I'm just going to let this be an implicit return again. And then that render. Let's see, is this like alignment all messed up now? Does this need to go over one? I think it does. And the other thing that we want to make sure that we put in the query is the title template. Yeah, I broke it. Data is not defined, right? Because I'm not passing anything down. I can at least shorten this a little bit, it seems like. The let's see, now that I'm thinking through this, do I want default SEO? Do I want to essentially mimic what they're doing here in this tutorial and set our head to a const and return the component like they are here rather than me referencing a different const? Yeah, you know what? I guess let's do that. Okay. With that said, then, we're not going to have this be an implicit return anymore. I keep going back and forth, sorry. This is the real world thought process. Is this... Oh boy. See, with all these like parentheses and squiggly brackets, I'm like ultra confused now. Does this even need to be here anymore? It does. Otherwise it errors. So okay, that's weird. Anyway, return. And in the return, instead of doing this const, I will just return helmet. Okay, what am I doing here? Let's back up for a second, because this got very strange all of a sudden. Okay. So instead of all of this, we want this. And we're going to have a return that does this. Wow, that, I don't know why that got so confusing so quickly. Great, there we go. Okay, title template. Okay, so I removed the head const up here. That is what we are leveraging elsewhere though, so I do want to set this to a const. So we're going to do const head equals instead of blanketing the props, we can do title and title template. Do we need to do that though? Title, description. Guess we don't. Because what we're going to inevitably end up doing is leveraging this head component on each individual page, and within the within layout here, we're likely going to want to remove the head from this like globalized component and put it in the individual page templates so that we can control the title of the page on the page template itself. So eventually what we're going to want is to have the head be imported here and be like head title equals you know, like the about us, and then close that off. So that's the end game here. We want to be able to override the title if we have it. So if we go back to the head here, let me close that so that it's a little bit easier to read. So we are going to want to pass the title down as props, but we may not have a title all the time. We want to leverage the title from the data if we don't have a title being passed to it. So I think actually that is where this comes in. Default. Right, okay. So in their Gatsby config, they, instead of calling this just straight up title, they called it default title, which we can do as well and call this default title. So this bit right here is just the data from our GraphQL query that we are passing down into our helmet component. If we want to leverage a prop from there, we have to do what they're doing, which is set a const that we will call meta. And within the meta, it's just an object that we will call title as just the variable name. Title is going to be the default title, or, and actually this needs to be the other way around. So it needs to be, if there is a title prop passed down to the head, then we're going to use the title prop. Otherwise, we're going to use default title. So that's what's happening here. That makes sense. And then from here, we can do meta.title and grab the title here. We want the title template to remain the same because that is the, yeah, that's the piece that we're leveraging there. Okay, cool. That makes sense. And now because we don't need to pass the title template down to it because we're only getting that from the GraphQL query, the next thing that we need to do is export default head. And I broke the GraphQL query somehow. Title template. I may need to restart the development server. I am still using data somewhere though. Oh, in the prop types. Interesting. Okay, so this makes it a little bit less convoluted to actually like type check everything. Because we're only passing title down, all we need to do is for title, it's going to be a, yeah, it's just going to be prop types dot string. And because it's not required, we need to set default props to it. So head.default props, default props, title. I guess if they're just doing null, we can do that too. Cannot query field title template because we need to restart the development server. Presumably, hopefully, fingers crossed. Cannot query field that is because we changed this from title to default title. So we need to make sure the GraphQL query reflects that change that we made in Gatsby config when we change this to default title. That is compiled successfully. That's great. So you can see in the title, it now has home because none of these have the prop passed down to it. I did do that on the About Us, but I didn't save it. So let's go to About Us and save this here. The reason that that's going to freak out is because we are using, or it's, I didn't import it. So import head from /theme. Yeah. Head. And I am going to, yeah, okay, that's fine. So I think the reason that that is going to freak out is because we have head set up in this layout component. So let's remove that and see where it gets us there. About Us home. Did I mess up? So this is working properly. I think that I just messed up the yeah. Yeah, I just messed up the template for this, right? So we want this to default to home, then the pipe, or no, we want this to default to House of Giants, then the pipe, then the dynamic name. Actually, I had that reversed too. That's the title template we want. There we go. And the default title, if we go to the home page, is going to be House of Giants, right? It's not going to do anything because on the index page, I don't have the head. So head title equals home. And I need to import the head. Import head from /theme head. Home House of Giants. About Us House of Giants. And the last one. Work. I keep forgetting to import the head. Amateur. Home. About Us. And work. Sweet. So on the index, like if I were to omit and not actually pass anything down, it's going to be House of Giants, which we don't want, which means we probably should change the template. We want the default title to just be House of Giants and not... How would we do that? Can I change? No, because we're not We're not passing the title template down as props. I suppose that we could. So like if we really wanted to, we could do title template here, set that as a prop, that if we wanted to change the title template, again, this would have to be default title template. And then we could pass that down in our query. We need to make sure we update this to default title template. And then in our meta const, we need title template to be equal to either the prop version of title template or the default title template. There you go. Default title template needs to be a comma and a comma. And then on the title template, we'll do meta.title template. Default title template. Cannot query that. Hopefully this just requires a restart, because we do have default title template set up properly there. Presumably if we go to the index and do title equals House of Giants, title template equals just, I guess, %s, right? Because we want the title to be the entire thing. That appears to work. Cool. I think that should be fine for right now. But it essentially gives us what we were looking for a week ago, right? Where we want to, it's not as dynamic as we were hoping, but it does allow us to, on a per page basis, dictate the page title in the tab there. Yeah, and I think that will work just fine. So that I think is going to be a good place for us to stop. Kind of a recap of the things that we went over. I really liked it. I learned a lot of interesting, some neat ways to kind of work with Gatsby here. So this was a good little episode for me. But just to recap kind of the things that we went over, we leveraged our GraphQL skills to add some stuff to the site metadata that we built last week. More specifically, the navigation items. We learned how to do build a dynamic navigation based on the data that we built into here. We added that to our navigation component. We leveraged a static query to use GraphQL to grab the name and the slug of those nav items, map over them, and output individual Gatsby links, which is this component that does a lot of fancy stuff to actually handle the routing, which makes things nice and smooth, super quick. We kind of talked about refactoring and when is a good time to refactor, when it makes sense to do that, the thought process behind the types of things you want other developers to be able to do with the components that you've built. And then we went through how to probably more properly leverage the SEO type of component, or the our document header management component. Added some defaults to the titles, learned about title templates, and here we are. So yeah, that was great. Thanks for hanging out. Thanks for sticking around. I'll throw this up on YouTube as soon as I can, so that we can kind of keep the series going there. If you've just watched this one, there's 2 other videos that I've got on YouTube about how we got to the point that we're at. they're a little longer. I post these things up unedited and just like straight up from the stream. I like to give people the insight into the entire process. I am by no means like a super genius that has all of this just like in my head, so I like to be able to hopefully give folks a little bit of insight into I feel like what is a relatively normal development process where like you kind of stumble through things a little bit. We Google some stuff and figure out like how to properly leverage this SEO component. We run through a tutorial together. I like to give folks this insight into what it actually is like being a developer who does this type of stuff. Super curious to hear if this is helpful for you folks. If you've watched any of the YouTube videos, if you found that kind of unedited version of it helpful, that's great. I'd love to know that. If it's super annoying and it's like really long and you just want like the highlights and like quick cuts between me struggling through things, I'll definitely take that feedback too. Just generally interested to see how folks are utilizing this content and if it's helpful to you in any way, shape, or form. So yeah, in any case, I appreciate you sticking around and hanging out. Thanks for watching. We'll see you later.